Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. And speaking of music and theater and history, those are really our subjects for today as we continue our Season 4 of the podcast about the story of modern Philadelphia theater and theater companies. We are going to talk about musical theater in the city, particularly the early decades of the American Music Theater Festival, musicals that were being staged by many other nonprofit theater companies such as the Arden and the Walnut, and about the new musical theater program at the University of the Arts, whose students were often filling the casts and crews and staffs of those very companies. And here today to talk with us is the perfect person to discuss all of those things, Charlie Gilbert, whose voice you will recognize because you likely all heard him asking the questions in our last episode about the Freedom Theater. Charlie is a self-described music theater specialist, but he also sometimes refers to himself as the Swiss Army knife of Philly theater because he can do so many things for you. He's a talented composer and lyricist, a director, an actor, a music arranger and conductor, and a writer. As an educator, he's done so much to help shape the lives and careers of hundreds of singers, actors, and musical theater students in the city, and he has a deep personal knowledge about Philly theater history. In fact, as we will learn, he was often right there in the room where it happened. Here's my conversation with Charlie, recorded in early July of 2025. Talking to Charlie Gilbert. Charlie, welcome to Adventures in Theater History.
Thank you, Peter.
You are one of the series of friends of the show that we've been privileged to talk to over the past few months. And you were one of the early supporters of the work on this project. And of course, you were my former colleague at the University of the Arts. We joint taught a course on the history of the theater, the whole thing.
That's right.
Over the course of 2 semesters, which I thought went terribly well. And that all ended in 2020 when the pandemic hit. But that wasn't the first time we began working together. You were one of the first people I worked with in Philadelphia because one of the first shows I did back in 2005, 2006 was the Dinosaur musical.
That's right, at the Arden Theater.
At the Arden Theater, a children's show written by the Reale brothers. And I played a couple dinosaurs, and you were the music director of the excellent band who was behind. You didn't have to dress up as dinosaurs, right?
No, we were out of sight. We were unseen by the audience. But no, that was great fun, and really enjoyed being part of that premiere production.
Right, and all the rest of us were swishing around with our dinosaur tails, and it was a fun show. Anyway, let me compliment you for the excellent quality of the microphone you were talking on. You, among all the guests we've had, you are the one person who has taken some effort to get a high-quality microphone during our conversation. So you sound excellent, I must say.
Well, thanks. Yes, I have a little setup in my home studio because I record demos here, creating songs for musicals, and so this is why I have this.
Tell us about your own personal backstory. Where did you start your work in the theater? You're not from Philadelphia originally.
Well, I'm from the area. I grew up in Chester County in Westchester, PA, and I did musicals at Henderson High School in Westchester. And then I was an undergrad at the University of Delaware, which is close by in Newark, Delaware. And it was really at Delaware that I caught the fever for musicals. I was a theater major there, but they let me write my own degree. I was a dean's scholar in musical theater at a time when it really wasn't possible to get an undergraduate degree in musical theater. I kind of made one up, and that meant I took music classes in composition and conducting, but also directing and acting and theater classes, and did a lot of projects. That was the heart of it. They actually gave me money to direct a one-act opera and write a children's musical and things like that. So I fell hard for musical theater as an undergrad. And then I went to Carnegie Mellon right after that and did an MFA in directing there. But I stayed in touch with my teachers at UD, and they, a couple of years later, invited me to apply for a teaching position. So I started my teaching career at the University of Delaware in 1979, teaching a course in musical theater performance and directing the musical there, and also doing some general theater teaching and finding out what it meant to be a college teacher. And that really turned out to be my life's calling, because from 1979 until I retired a couple of years ago, that was my main gig, was being a college professor with a focus in musical theater.
Wow. When did you actually move into the city of Philadelphia?
Well, I started teaching at UArts part-time in the late 1980s, and full-time I joined the faculty there in 1990. And then at the time I was living in Wilmington, Delaware, and commuting to Philly. But we moved here a little over 20 years ago, 2002.
And when you say we, you mean your wonderful wife, Darcy Webb.
My wife, Darcy, and my family. I had two boys, now adult men, but at the time they were young boys. And we moved here and have made our home in South Philly for over 20 years now.
At some point, you had an idea for a musical play, which was about a Vietnam vet who wants to assassinate the president. It began with an idea of a shooting gallery saying, hit the president and win a prize.
Right. Hit the president, win a prize. That's right.
And did you send the script around? How were you developing this project?
Well, I started writing a musical called Assassins. That was the title of my musical in 1978. When I was, after grad school, I was working for a theater company in Pittsburgh called Theater Express. I was their resident music director, and the artistic director knew I was interested in creating new work, as was he. And he said, when I told him in this idea, he said, well, that sounds perfect. Go ahead and write that and we'll put it on. So I was very, very lucky early on in the history of that project to have somebody say yes to that idea. And it was really based on the lives of all the different presidential assassins in American history, starting with John Wilkes Booth up through the present day, which at that point included Lee Harvey Oswald, of course. So I not only had the idea, but I wrote the musical, and it was produced. Theater Express produced my musical called Assassins.
I didn't know that.
In early 1979. At that point, I was dating Darcy. So, our courtship took place around that musical, if you can imagine. I was lucky that she wasn't completely creeped out by it.
Oh, it gave you a dark allure, I'm sure.
Yes, that was it. The dark allure. But anyway, after it was done in Pittsburgh, as one does, I started to send it around to places, and I sent it as a kind of portfolio piece for a program that was trying to match up young writers and mentors. And I was one of the young writers, a finalist for that program. And Steve Sondheim, unbeknownst to me, was one of the mentors in that program. So Steve read my musical in the early 1980s and got in touch with me. This was like maybe 1985, I think, got in touch with me to say, I've always remembered that idea you had for that musical about assassins, and I would like to take that idea and try to write a musical of my own about that. How would you be okay with that? And we'll make sure you get all the proper credit for the idea and so on. And so we talked, and I said yes. The lawyers got involved, and we signed the papers, and that led to the creation of the musical that he wrote with John Weidman. He didn't want to
offered to write the book, but he said, "No, I'm working with John Weidman."
Yeah, I did offer to collaborate, but he passed on that one, and chose John, who wrote a magnificent libretto for this idea. Come here and kill the president. And I got to be on the sidelines for the development of their project. I traveled to New York and saw workshops and was there for the opening, and the piece has had a terrific success and found its place in the pantheon of 20th century American musicals, much to my astonishment and delight, and my name has traveled with it.
Yes, whenever the production is done, you see that Charlie Gilbert is right there on it, based on an idea by Charles Gilbert. So we'll return to Assassins later, but that is such an amazing and wonderful story. But you've offered to come here today to talk about the development of musicals and music theater in the 1980s and 90s, specifically as it relates to the history of Philadelphia theater. And you were just the person to talk about this because you're teaching, you're still teaching, and you teach a class, I think now at Drexel University. Is that right?
That's right. I'm teaching at Drexel this summer.
All right. So you sent me your slides that you were showing your students, and it was just fascinating to me. You talked to your students about how the concept of American music theater was changing in the 1980s. This was when I think back to the 1980s, a time that I was working as a young actor in New York. Except for Stephen Sondheim, the music theater was a pretty dead, on this in terms of Broadway, was fairly moribund. Mostly there was large British music. It was famously the British Invasion and Andrew Lloyd Webber and all that. But you were saying that part of that was because there was a distinction that was happening amongst the creative class between music theater and musical theater. What do you mean by that?
Well, the terms are confusing. Music theater is a term that kind of shows up more in Europe than it does in America. But when you talk about the literature of works that involve singing and music and storytelling and spectacle, that can include opera, it can include the Broadway musical and the commercial Broadway musical, but there's also a whole category of work called music theater, which is neither opera nor Broadway, but which uses music and dance in other ways to tell often stories that are nonlinear in nature. The 1980s saw one of the big attention-grabbing examples of that in the 1980s was Einstein on the Beach, a collaboration with Philip Glass, the composer, and Robert Wilson, the stage director, that was presented at the Met in 1980. And it was right around that same time in the early 80s that a couple of intrepid entrepreneurs came up with the idea of creating the American Music Theater Festival, which was a festival that was intended to be all-inclusive. It was going to embrace all three of those categories of commercial musical theater, opera, and experimental music theater. It was a very ambitious artistic brief they set for themselves.
So these people that you're talking about, that was Eric Saltzman and Marjorie Samoff?
That's right.
And why did they choose Philadelphia as the place to set up this theater, American music theater, but in Philadelphia, not in New York where you might expect it to be?
Well, Marjorie is a native of Philadelphia and was affiliated with an opera company in Philly in the years before she started AMTF. Eric was based in New York, specifically in Brooklyn, where he lived for many years and was known as a scholar and practitioner in this field of experimental music theater. So they felt that Philadelphia was ripe for such an undertaking because it was close enough to New York that they would have access to New York artists, but also far enough away that people would come, and to get out of New York and the critical scrutiny that comes with being in New York to try some different kinds of
experiments. Well, that's the old thing from the tryout days. I mean, I've talked in the podcast about how the early 1980s, Philadelphia is no longer a tryout town, but that had always been the rationale for bringing shows to Philly. That, we can develop them out here where we can easily get there, but nobody that we really care about is going to come and see them, so we can mess around with things and not worry about the pressure. But you're saying that just as that commercial phenomenon was dying down, Philadelphia as a nonprofit venue begins to seem is still attractive for just the same reasons.
Well, it was attractive at the moment, and they were able to sell this idea to the city fathers and to the funders in the city in the 1980s, so that they established from the very beginning a very ambitious festival. And it was not year-round programming, but it was festival-style programming that just focused on a couple of weeks in the summer where there were multiple works going down.
Early July into August. That was their usual plan. Just when everything else had died down, and a lot of venues were available for limited rent.
Right.
But now, which was the same back in the days of the old tryout shows, but back then places didn't have air conditioning, but now they did. So you could do a summer theater festival and people wouldn't be miserable. But this is also just at the time, 1982 was the time when Bernard Havard arrives at the Walnut Street Theater. The Drama Guild had moved out, and the people who ran the Walnut decided to become their own producing organization. They bring up Bernard, who had been at the Alliance Theater in Atlanta. And he starts producing his own shows. Bernard is still in charge of the Walnut Street Theater, I'd like to point out. He started out by doing 4 straight plays and just 1 musical. And in 1983, he started with just a revival of a classic, although originally London, Broadway-style musical, Oliver, Lionel Bart's show. And then the next year he does The Music Man. The year after that he does Gypsy. And then he does a little night music, one of the few Sondheim shows the Walnut's ever done. And it does an original show, Mike, which is about Mike Todd. Is that right? The producer, Mike Todd?
That's right. And not to make any Zelig-like claims here, but I was actually I worked on Mike. I was the assistant music director on that production. So I was there in the room with the composer,
Mitch
Lee, and Lee Adams, the lyricist, and Martin Charnin was the director. Actually, he was the second director of that project. And so it was like big New York egos come to Philadelphia.
Well, Mitch Lee had such a huge success with Man of La Mancha in the 60s. It was a former ad man who had made a lot of money in advertising and then had this big hit with Man of La Mancha, and then had all this money to burn and kept working for the rest of his life on one musical project or another. I've talked about some of them in the book, the King and Oi, the one that Molly Picon walked out on, and but never actually getting anywhere. He's not with us anymore. So any Mitch Lee stories you'd like to share with us?
Well, I remember the what they call the Sitzprobe, the first orchestra rehearsal with the cast, where Mitch came in and lit up a cigar and enjoyed a cigar in the room while we were playing the music, and that which was pretty felt a little transgressive even then at that point. But so also in the cast was Robert Morse, the bad boy New York star. So it was quite a gathering of individuals for this project.
And did it eventually go on to Broadway? Or it did not?
After a couple of years, it did open on Broadway. It had a different title then. It was called Ain't Broadway Grand.
Oh, that's why I've missed that before.
Yeah, and it was not successful on Broadway.
Okay.
And,
I guess I was only partly right. Ain't Broadway Grand does recall the past. In fact, it copies it, and not the best parts either. In terms of style, form, and content.
Time for Philadelphia theater audiences and for Walnut Street Theater subscribers who wanted that kind of New York cachet. This was an exciting project to be able to see in Philadelphia.
Well, that goes on to be the Walnut Street Theater's brand. It does Broadway-type musicals, occasionally develops its own work, but usually it is reviving well-known works that its audience is familiar with, look forwards to see. And by the 1990s, they're doing 2 musicals a year and then suddenly 3 musicals a year, which they continue to do to this day, including a big holiday show of some sort. And that continues to be very successful for them. Well, for a while, they had the biggest subscription audience in the country. They've always had much larger budgets than everyone else, and they're paying a Lord A rates to their actors, so they have significant payrolls. Really, I think Bernard deserves a lot of credit for developing the local theater scene. Just that a lot of people, by working there, maybe even just 1 or 2 shows a year, got a good paycheck and enough that they could subsidize all the other things they wanted to do the rest of the year.
Yes, a Walnut Street gig, a gig at the Nut was considered a prime job, and
right.
It was a good paying job, and certainly it was something that actors were glad to get, and the Walnut did that and hired a lot of people, hired a lot of the students who came out of UArts.
Right.
As we trained them with their BFA at UArts, they got work at the Walnut, and that became a really career path into the industry.
Right, as well as for designers and technical people. Their technical have always been top-notch, high Broadway level lighting design, great musicians in the pit, although never a full orchestra. Usually, in my experience, the strings are all synthesized. But it's been a reliable, steady presence. And on top of that, Bernard has fostered other company. When he started in a smaller space upstairs, an independent studio, one of the first things he did was to host this young guy named Terry Nolan and his wife Amy and Aaron Posner, who were just out of Northwestern and wanted to start this little company they called the Arden Theater Company. And Bernard basically said, "Okay, I'll take half, you take half of the box office, but I won't charge you rent. Go ahead." And we'll come back to the Arden, but I really give Bernard a lot of credit for what happens in Philadelphia from the 1980s into the 1990s. But before you started working at the Walnut, let's go back to 1984 and the opening of the American Music Theater Festival. Now, you were also involved in a production in their first season.
That's right. I was assistant to the director, Frank Corsaro, on a production of Strike Up the Band that actually played at the Walnut Street Theater
Right.
on their stage in the summertime.
Yeah.
This was a reconstruction of a George Gershwin and Georges Kaufman musical from the 20s.
Yes, we talked about it in our episode of the 1920s. It died after a single weekend. It never went, and they tried to revive it, but it was a famous failed satirical musical.
Right. Right, and they actually made two different attempts to make that work, one in the 20s and one in the 30s, and then it kind of disappeared from view until some scholars found the manuscripts in a warehouse, and Eric Saltzman, who was the artistic director for American Music Theater Festival, got involved in the reconstruction of that, and so that was a high-profile revival of a classic musical, the sort of thing that they do now with encore, city center encores, or things like that. All this was fully staged, but it was, very very good New York stars that they brought in for the cast.
Bill Irwin,
Bill Irwin was among them, and Maurice Paris was the conductor for that. So it was very very top-tier talent for that. And over the years, that was one of the things that was a calling card for AMTF. They brought good talent to do kind of classic but neglected musicals, things that were part of the past that had fallen from favor.
Although I noticed, am I right that it had to close a little bit early, just like the original one? The run didn't go as long as they had hoped?
I don't remember the details of that. I remember certainly all the Sturm und Drang leading up to the opening, because with every musical the Hell Week of tech and dress rehearsals and so on is always fraught, and there were changes then, papers flying and things being pasted into the score. And
and I've also heard from someone else who was there at the opening night that many celebrities and politicians were there because it was a great big opening, and they had gotten so many bigwigs to back it. I mean, their business plan was great, but whoever was running the festival box office there for the opening night hadn't this is their account. They had not alphabetized the envelopes, which had all the VIP tickets in them. So when somebody walked up and said, "Hello, I'm Senator Arlen Specter," they would go, Arlen Specter, I know that's in here somewhere. And they would take about 10 minutes to find. And so the line started backing up. And these were very important people who were not used to waiting for inefficiency. So there was so much big things that were going right, but some smaller things, I suppose inevitable with a startup organization, were a little rough. But there was another production, very fascinating. They were doing it almost at the same time, and that was the classic Eugene O'Neill play, The Emperor Jones, which we've talked about several times in the podcast because it was very big for Jasper Dieter, who did the original Smithers, and he did it all the time out at the Hedgerow Theater. And Paul Robeson, of course, had actually done it on the Walnut stage back in the 1920s in a single reading with Dieter. But originally they wanted to get James Earl Jones, right, who had done it during the 60s and 70s, but he had backed out, and now they've gotten Cleavon Little play the Emperor Jones, and the choreographer Donald McKay, is that right? McHale, yeah, had reconceived it, and they'd gotten a composer, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, who had brought in West Indian dances and drumming. It was they cleaned up a lot of the objectionable parts of the script. Do you remember seeing that production as well?
I didn't see that one, and really, Peter, it was your account of Emperor Jones that you recently put on the Facebook in your feed for the podcast that reminded me that even happened. That was a project that I didn't see because I was working on several other shows in that season. I worked on Strike Up the Band, and I worked on Mrs. Farmer's Daughter was another project
which
that
is
I
about
worked.
Francis Farmer,
right. Yes, with
the actress.
Music and lyrics by Jack Eric Williams, who was better known as the actor who played Beetle Bamford in Sweeney Todd.
Ah, okay.
But that was So they needed some help at rehearsals there. So I remember after Strike Up the Band, I went there. It was fortunate for me because I've always been a sort of Swiss Army knife of music theater talent. I play, I write music, but I understand play production and so on. So they could send me in to do various things in various places, and I could be helpful in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, but as often happens, when you're a working theater artist, you are intensely working on one thing, and people say, like, well, did you see this other thing at the same time? You go, nope, I couldn't get out of this room right here to get over there to see that. So you'll have to tell me about it sometime.
Yeah, no, after the fact, it sounds very cool. Donald McHale and the Caribbean drums and the Emperor Jones sounds like I
way over at the what is now the Seaport Museum, of that auditorium that's over there by the Delaware River. I've occasionally seen shows produced there, but it's a little out of the way for most of the theater-going world. But they also did shows at the old Trocadero, which was the old burlesque house, which was literally falling down.
Right.
So they were taking advantage of a lot of the deep history of Philadelphia theater to bring this thing off.
Now, the Troc, which I remember, certainly we've talked about the Trocadero and the role that it played in Philadelphia theater history, but at the time it had been kind of a seedy joint, and then they produced an opera there. They produced Anthony Davis's X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, there in one of its I think they did the first season, they did just the first act, and then the second season they did the whole work, and eventually just last year that work finally had its project. Work finally had its Met debut just last year, so some 40 years later it finally made it to the Met.
Which was exactly Marjorie Samoff's point when she started this whole thing. She said, a lot of great works of art take a lot of development. It's hard to get everything just right. And if we don't have this opportunity to come into a studio and be well supported and try and put it up on its feet and see how it works, you will never know what works and what doesn't. There's a Broadway opening typically is like everything succeeds or fails in the first night. But if you give something time, you can really create maybe a great work of art. And maybe this story of the Malcolm X opera really shows the truth of that.
I think so. And I think that certainly the history of musical theater, we remember the successes, but it's important to know that in the background of that for every successful musical, there's probably another 10 that floundered or struggled or didn't get off the ground for one reason or another. Maybe some of those were good ideas, but couldn't find the right backing. And some of them were, couldn't find the right form or whatever. But the American Music Theater Festival was a remarkable place where they could give space for all kinds of work, not just work by people who were known as commercial composers, but also people who were important in the world of opera and people who were up and coming in the experimental music theater world as well. This was a place where early on in her career, Julie Taymor directed with her husband, the composer Elliot Goldenthal. And of course, this was before Julie Taymor became an international celebrity because of The Lion King.
Right.
And there were other individuals as well. I believe Diane Paulus, who's now at ART, was one of the early career artists. And I remember George C. Wolfe directing Duke Ellington's Queenie Pie for
Noah Ain, who eventually wrote the music for Metamorphosis, did her work Trio, a story for three women at the American Music Theater Festival. And that was over in the hall that eventually became the University of the Arts, right? They did that in the Great Hall. Probably, again, you didn't get a chance to see it because you were working.
I didn't see that one, but I saw a couple of pretty amazing theater experiences produced by AMTF in the Great Hall. The most memorable one, I think, was in their second or third season. They did Harry Partch's The Revelation in the Courthouse Park, which was an adaptation or a riff on the Bacchae by a composer from the 1960s that featured all handmade instruments and to go with an original musical scale that this composer had created. So he was writing very odd and original music. And
so not even Schoenberg, something beyond that.
Oh, wow. It's way out there. And so the Great Hall was filled with these, glass bowls and big slabs of wood and steel that were made into specially tuned percussion instruments. And that was a wild spectacle and the perfect spot for it too.
But the structure of various nonprofit theaters throughout the country was allowing composers like that and theater artists like that to create work. And one of the works that was then rising was Bob Telson, Lee Brewer's project coming out of the Mabou Mines group in New York called The Gospel at Colonus. They had started developing the idea that Sophocles' play, the third of the Oedipus trilogy, could become a musical using the traditions and music of the African American church. And that story could be told by using various, there's not just one type of gospel music, there's sort of the deep history of church and gospel music could get retold through this narrative. And they started developing it, I believe at BAM, and then they did it at Arena Stage. So this was like in 83 and 84. But then in 1985, the second season of AMTF, it comes to Philadelphia. Marjorie gets a backing for it and they're going to do it at the Zellerbach Theater, which we've talked about, the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. And by this point, Morgan Freeman, who has a history in Philadelphia theater, but now comes back, is playing the lead evangelist in it. Clarence Fountain and the Five Blind Boys of Alabama, I think, had always been connected to it. And they put on an amazing production, which gets recorded for great performances. PBS came in and recorded the whole thing. Were you there? Did you see that one, I hope?
I did attend that in person. That was one of my top 5 theater going experiences in a long life of theater going. I remember.
Wow.
I remember that and the impact of that. And because there is this wonderful video document that was produced for great performances, you can relive that again. It's kind of ironic because Lee Brewer and Bob Telson, the composer, were both white artists,
sure,
writing in a deeply black tradition. You're trying to create a work that was set in the Pentecostal church,
right,
and with such an authentic sound and such an authentic vibe to it. But it was
and it was a Philadelphia
powerful
black church choir that was providing the chorus.
That's
this,
right.
This bank of people in African dress and who were calling out and supporting and rising to their feet, and so much energy in that room. I can tell from I didn't see it until there was a attempt to bring it to Broadway several years later, and I remember sitting in the back. I got a cheap seat in the back, and at one point they had to stop the show because some riser had not come on, and Morgan Freeman had to say to everybody, "Hold on, we're dealing with something." And there was this guy behind me that kept talking excitedly, and I turned around and told him to shh. And it turned out that was Lee Brewer. Would you not talk so much? But obviously he was hard at work on this. But that became just an iconic moment for the 1985 production at the Zellerbach. Just became iconic for what the AMTF could do when it put its mind to it. Something wildly successful and influential.
It seemed like at that point in the late 1980s that AMTF was really on the map as an institution of national importance. They were getting national press. They were getting covered in the Times and in the magazines and so on. And people were recognized that there was something really significant that was happening in musical theater in Philadelphia.
Which is interesting because, again, I'm working as a young actor in New York at the time. And to me, although a couple of my NYU classmates had gone off to work at People's Light and Theater out in the suburbs, to me, going to Philadelphia was just like falling off the end of the earth. And there was one point where I was working literally in someone's living room. It was this guy named Adam Giddle had composed a musical about this guy that gets stuck in a cave called Floyd Collins, and it was being directed by a college classmate of mine, Tina Landau. And afterwards, the musical, the workshop goes fine. We do it literally in his living room in a loft space. And they say, yeah, we're going to bring this down to Philadelphia and do it at the American Music Theater Festival. And I was like, what? That shows the cluelessness that I had at the time, but it did. Floyd Collins then did come down here and was developed. Again, it's only recently made its way to Broadway. It's had a long incubation period.
Well, Floyd Collins is a fascinating story for me because Floyd Collins was one of the works that grew out of a partnership that we created early on between the University of the Arts and the American Music Theater Festival. AMTF came first before there was musical theater at UArts, but when I joined the faculty At UArts, I knew Marjorie and Eric, and they knew that I was very much in support of what they were doing. And as musical theater became an academic prospect at the University of the Arts, we were talking about, well, how can we work together? This would be the perfect marriage of two institutions if we could find a way to support
University of the
that.
Arts was then fairly new. It had been a amalgamation of the Museum Art School and the music program, and then it had brought in a theater program. It created one, which Walter Dallas ran. And then you're saying, when did the music theater program join this new institution called University of the Arts?
Music theater became a degree option in 1991. The theater school was started in 1984, and right. That was before the merger of what was then the Philadelphia College of Performing Arts and the Philadelphia College of Art. So the merger happened in the late 80s, and that was about the time when I started to work there. And that was also the time, as you observed, when things were kind of taking off at American Music Theater Festival. And so kind of early on, we hit on the idea of trying to do some works that we would develop jointly, where we would have a combined ensemble of undergrads from UArts and professionals who would be brought in from out of town. And a lot of the funding for that came from a 3-year grant that AMTF got. And we called it the Resident Ensemble Project. And Floyd Collins was one of the first projects to grow out of that. So that there was a period of some weeks when Adam and Tina and Teresa McCarthy and Martin Moran, some of the people who are very connected with that piece as performers, were in Philadelphia, along with a handful of University of the Arts students, and we did an extended rehearsal process. And I remember every week there was a session where the undergraduate students would all come together for what we called convocation. And at that particular one, Adam came in with his guitar and he said, well, I was working on this thing last night and it kind of goes like this. And he plays his guitar and he sings the Ballad of Floyd Collins, and it was just one of those you had to have been there kind of moments, right. And so that piece very much had its roots in Philly and UArts. Actually, one of the UArts students who was in that first workshop, Jesse Lynat was his name. Jesse went on to do the professional main stage premiere of that work at AMTF, and then the New York premiere at Playwrights Horizons. Jesse was in that as well, and so he's on the album for that show.
So there were other projects that throughout the 1990s. One that I particularly noticed was one that came down from ART called Schlemiel the First, with music by Han Kuznetsky, who is from Northwest Philadelphia, a Yiddish musical based upon a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer. All the reviewers at the time that I read said this was the best thing that's happened all year. It came in by the end of June. They did it at the Walnut. It was a big smash success. And Laurie Anderson also came down too. Was that during the 1990s to work on something?
Yes, Laurie Anderson was involved at AMTF, premiered a couple of different pieces there. I think a solo piece and then a couple of pieces that involved her Moby Dick, which was a project that involved an ensemble of actors and musicians, was presented at American Music Theater Festival. And Laurie Anderson was one of the first artists to receive an honorary doctorate from the University of the Arts. So we kind of embraced her and her cross-disciplinary experimentation as
that must have been very popular with your students. She would be exactly the vibe that they were looking for. She's an out there person with that famous short haircut and her playing multiple instruments and doing solo work, I think provocative things. That must have gone over like gangbusters.
Well, among a certain group it did. I mean, a lot of the music theater students were all, in my experience, were very Broadway oriented. Their taste didn't necessarily run to that freaky stuff. I remember showing Laurie Anderson's Home of the Brave, which is a great music film, in music theater history class. And, like a third of the room would get excited and the other 2/3 would be kind of like, what is this weird stuff? Of course, Laurie Anderson is kind of the model for Joanne in Rent.
Right.
Yeah, when that Over the Moon that she does. I'm sorry, it's Maureen in Rent, does Over the Moon, and that was a kind of riff on Laurie Anderson.
Which is exactly the same thing. Everyone is going like, what? Some people are going, amazing. Other people are going, I don't know what you're doing. But you're out there.
Yeah, you're talking into a vocoder and I'm mooing. What's going on?
Right.
Yes.
So that the music theater geeks would get into that. They, oh, she's the bassist for Marine and Ren. Oh, now I like her.
Right.
But by the 1990s, the Arden Theater had moved out after a couple of seasons upstairs at the Walnut, had moved to its own small space over at behind St. Stephen's Church on Ludlow Street. The Drew family, which I always takes things back to the Drews and the Barrymores, was their family church back in the day. But now the little parish house behind it had become available, and the Arden Theater had turned its little stage and gym area into a theater. They start doing musicals. I think one of the first ones they did was Working. And then the next one, they had a big hit in 1993 with their production of Sweeney Todd in that tiny little space. Were you able to catch that one?
I didn't see any of the Arden Theater musicals at St. Stephen's. I began to work with the Arden in the 90s when they were in Old City in their new home there.
Right. By 95, they moved to their now present home on 2nd
Right.
Street, north of Christ Church. And again, they restaged Sweeney Todd there by 2005. But we then start to have within the musical theater world, it seems to me, again, I wasn't there at the time, so I'm asking for your validation about this interpretation, that there's the Walnut, which is holding down this huge subscription audience and doing big Broadway shows, broad, wide appeal. The Arden is usually doing a Sondheim piece. They began to specialize in Sondheim, yes? I think by this point they've done them all.
Almost all of them. I think they maybe not the very late ones, but they've done nearly all of them, and certainly that's a writer that I know Terry Nolan had tremendous admiration for.
Right, as well as they would do Leonard Bernstein. They would do like Candide. Something would be done at the Arden. And then there's occasionally the Philadelphia Theater Company would do musicals. We talked to Sarah about their production of the Scottsboro Boys, but the Walnut and the Arden sort of corner most of the market on producing nonprofit theater musicals, except for something that you started working on in the 1990s. And now we'll come back to Assassins. Tell us about how Assassins comes back to Philadelphia.
Well, after Assassins, the Sondheim-Weidman Assassins opened off-Broadway in January of 1991. During the late 80s and 1990, I was kind of watching very closely as they were bringing that together. So after it opened in New York, and it had a very short sold-out run at Playwrights Horizons, and then didn't transfer to Broadway. It was one of the few Sondheim musicals that didn't make the jump from off-Broadway to Broadway, like Sunday in the Park had done, and like
Right.
Into the Woods had done. And so there was this great feeling of, was it a success or was it a failure? After that production ended, and things felt very unresolved. But one thing that I thought was I would like to help bring that show to Philadelphia. And at the time I was teaching at UArts, and one of my colleagues there was Paul Wager, by name, was the artistic director of a small company called Philadelphia Area Repertory Theater. Had done 1 or 2 seasons, and they wanted to produce Assassins. And so they approached me about directing that, and I was very excited to have that opportunity. Well, that same season, apparently, Terry Nolan wanted to direct Assassins at the Arden, and so both companies had applied for the rights to produce the show in Philadelphia. And Paul Wagar told me that they didn't think they were going to be able to get the rights because the Arden, which was a bigger and more reputable theater, had requested it. And I said, well, let me see what I can do. And I put in a call to Mr. Sondheim, and he managed to intervene on our behalf and got the rights for Assassins for part. So we did the premiere of that in the basement of the Bourse, the big old building on
right, which we talked about
Liberty
before,
Bell.
which has now become by this point had become where everyone's offices was. So the AMTF offices were there, the Philadelphia Theater Company offices were there.
But down in the basement there was a quirky space that had been made into a kind of experimental theater, 100-seat theater, and that's where we did Assassins in I think it was in 1993, and with a production that had a really interesting mix of people in it. Some of them people were my colleagues at UArts, people like Neil Hartley. My wife, Darcy, was in it. She played very memorably, played Sarah Jane Moore in that production. A lot of great local talent, and then a handful of my students as well. So it was a great production. I remember we got great reviews, and there was a lot of buzz around that when that happened. And then later on, of course, the Arden produced it and produced it a couple of times since then.
Yeah. In their big sort of black box space. But I'm interested that the Bourse, which we've talked about, was originally, which had been abandoned by its original purpose and then became the home for that bicentennial production, eventually has an interesting history in theater, although again, it seems to be a bit abandoned at the moment. I think they're bringing it back again. By the late 1990s, AMTF never had its own home. It was always looking, like many theaters, it was always finding the summer theaters that were available, often the Walnut or the Annenberg or other places. But it decides to get a home of its own. And it finds an old movie theater on Chestnut Street, just south of City Hall. And by 1997, they had architectural plans for it, and they were going to call it the Prince Music Theater. Who was the Prince in the music theater?
Well, the Prince was Harold Prince, who was an early supporter of Marjorie's. I mean, she had gotten promotional quotes from Hal Prince talking about the importance of the work that this company could have for the American musical theater, and so Hal was an early supporter of the company.
He'd gone to the University of Pennsylvania, right, back in the 1950s. So he always had, although he didn't grow up here, this was always a place that he knew about, and there was the small Prince Theater upstairs at the Annenberg, which he'd also supported, but now this was the big Prince Theater.
Right.
Yeah. And they got a big Hirschfeld mural on the wall, right? With basically with all these amazing figures from American musical theater. You can still go see it. It's quite a spread. But what was, as you recall it, Marjorie's idea for creating the Prince into a home with both a large, big proscenium space downstairs and then a smaller black box space upstairs?
Well, it really represented an evolution of the producing model that the company was doing. As I said, they started out doing festival programming, but then wanted to have a more year-round presence in Philadelphia as part of the year-round theater season, and that meant finding spaces where they could produce, and that was difficult because it was at that particular moment it was a busy scene, and we did a lot of productions at Plays and Players, productions at the Mandel Theater, at Drexel, different venues, but we're all sort of looking for venues, and finally she and her board hit on the idea that they wanted to be landlords. They wanted to have a space of their own, and they were going to have it purpose-built for the kind of work that they did. So they made an auditorium, a modest auditorium, I think about 350 or 400 seats, but with an orchestra pit so that it could be used for operas and musicals. They had a black box theater. They had a rehearsal hall, and there weren't offices in that building, but there were dressing rooms and production spaces, and it was really a kind of realization of a great vision. They did an enormous fundraising push, as one has to do to make a building like that happen, and wound up with a big mortgage that they had to pay. That was like a financial millstone around their neck in the years to come. And I think you've talked about that a little bit in terms of how the Suzanne Roberts Theater kind of worked out to be a similar sort of issue with the Philadelphia Theater Company. And of course, this was right at the time that the Kimmel Center was being built, and so a lot of the fundraiser, a lot of the philanthropic support for buildings for the arts was really going in to make the Kimmel Center. So it was a time when the environment for fundraising was very competitive.
Right. And so for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with Philadelphia, we should mention that what is now south of the Academy of Music, our old friend, is now a huge complex, this huge soaring silver and glass, which is the home of the Philadelphia Orchestra. It is the place where the Kimmel Center now owns and runs the Academy, as well as the old often other places in town, but that the Kimball Center campus, they sometimes call it. So that's just a gargantuan presence right there in town. And it's all part of the Avenue of the Arts, and it was supposed to create this energy up and down Broad Street, all the way from the Arts Bank had been converted from an old bank building there in the corner of South and Broad Street. The Suzanne Roberts Theater, the Wilma Theater. As you go up, there was the Kimmel Center. There was the Academy of Music, of course, and now there's the Prince just south of City Hall. So there's a lot of venues along that particular strip in a way that there really had not been since the 1930s. And was there a feeling that it was all a bit top heavy and there was more sort of infrastructure there than the system could hold?
Well, my experience of it was all positive. As 21st century began, with all of those spaces occupying the Avenue of the Arts, and with the musical theater program at UArts occupying what was called the Terra Building there at the corner of Broad and Walnut,
we really felt
we felt like we were really in the middle of a vibrant arts district, and that was a great recruiting tool for us. Students really wanted to come to Philadelphia and be part of that energy. We were able to place students with opportunities at the Prince, at the Philadelphia Theater Company, at the Wilma. We were working with all of those companies, and so it was a really rich moment in terms of theater and specifically musical theater activity in Philadelphia as the new millennium began.
Right. And then
I wish it could say that it had lasted, but the bubble had to burst eventually.
It does. Now, we won't go there in this conversation. We'll just sort of wave our hand at it, because I'd really like to leave it right there at the turn of the century, as things are going full bore for Philadelphia theater, and musical theater has been leading the way as part of the and people in Philadelphia audiences had always come to support musicals and operettas and operas. There was a rich musical tradition. The Curtis School of Music is right there owned by Rittenhouse. So there's an enormous wealth of musical talent in the city, and there was an audience there and backers there to support it. So that really was a rich time, it seems to me, in the performance history of the city.
I agree. It really was a kind of golden age moment. And I was very lucky to kind of be there in the middle of it, and also to have, be training students in the midst of that, because I think that it really had a big impact on my students and on what the kinds of futures that they could envision for themselves and the kind of work that they wanted to do.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for talking to us about Philadelphia Musical Theater and Philadelphia Music Theater in the 1980s and 90s. This has been such a big help to me. It's cleared up so many storylines that I've started but didn't know where to take. This has been a conversation that's really tied a lot together, and I appreciate so much you coming and sharing your erudition and your personal experience with us today.
Happy to do it, Peter. It was fun to remember all of that with you.
All right, great.
There's a spark of life that sleeps in every seed.
That's our show. My thanks to Charlie once again for being such a calm and steady hand at the wheel. Ever since I arrived in the city, I learned I could always depend on him, and that has never changed. As our playoff music you can hear in the background today, we are listening to the late, great Philadelphia actress Joylette Harris singing Charlie's song, Have a Little Faith, from a holiday musical about Christmas trees that Charlie wrote in 2022, entitled A Tiny Miracle. I'll put a link to Charlie's own website in the show notes, where you can learn about his work, including his book, The Savvy Singing Actor, that's SAVI, which documents his teaching methods. I should mention, Charlie also recently became the executive director of Music Collab, a new nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the climate for developing and showcasing new musical theater work, and to cultivating a supportive community of musical theater creators for networking, professional, and artistic development in the greater Philadelphia region. This is your self-appointed Philly theater history maven, Peter Schmitz, signing off, reminding you all, in the midst of these troubled times, have a little faith in the healing power of music and art and theater, and the community it offers to us in all of our lives. Thanks to all of you for listening to the show today and for coming along on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.
What kind of miracle you were meant to be? Listen to the trees. Take it easy.